The American medic held out a small white pill. The prisoner's hand trembled as he stared at it. His name was Klaus Weber. He was 18 years old. His left hand was rotting from infection, red streaks climbing toward his heart. This pill, this single dose of penicillin, represented something Klaus had been taught was impossible that an enemy would choose to save his life. Because in the 8 months since his capture, Klaus had learned one lesson carved into his bones: authority figures don't heal. They punish. They abandon. They let you die. But Corporal Thomas Fletcher was about to shatter that belief with medicine Klaus never thought a German prisoner would receive. Klaus sits on the examination table in the Camp Breckenridge Medical Clinic. It is July 18th, 1944. The Kentucky summer heat presses through the window screens, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant bacon from the mess hall. Corporal Fletcher unwraps the filthy bandage from Klaus's left hand, and the smell of infection cuts through everything else in the room. Sweet, rotten, unmistakable. The kind of smell that means tissue is dying. Fletcher's face goes still when he sees the wound. A 1-inch cut across Klaus's palm, but the tissue around it is inflamed, swollen to twice normal size, weeping pus through cracks in the darkened skin. Red streaks run up Klaus's forearm like poison ivy vines, tracking the lymphatic system toward his heart. Lymphangitis. Blood poisoning. If this reaches his heart, Klaus will be dead in 48 hours. Fletcher takes Klaus's temperature. The thermometer reads 102.4 degrees Fahrenheit. He checks Klaus's pulse. 110 beats per minute. The infection has gone systemic. Klaus's body is fighting a war. It's losing. Private Henry Zimmerman stands beside the examination table. He is 26 years old, born in Milwaukee to German immigrant parents fluent in both languages. He translates Fletcher's questions into German and Klaus's answers back into English. His voice is careful, neutral, giving nothing away. Fletcher asks when the injury happened. Klaus says 3 weeks ago. Fletcher asks why Klaus waited so long to seek treatment. Klaus hesitates, then says he did not think anyone would help him. He is a prisoner. Prisoners do not get medical care. Fletcher looks at Klaus for a long moment. Then he says something that Zimmerman translates carefully, watching Klaus's face for the reaction. In this camp, prisoners receive the same medical care as American soldiers. That is protocol. Klaus stares at Fletcher. His fever-bright eyes try to process this statement. It makes no sense. It violates everything Klaus knows about how the world works. His face shows confusion, then disbelief, then the slow dawning assumption that this must be mockery. Some kind of American joke he doesn't understand. Fletcher doesn't wait for Klaus to believe him. He turns to the medical cabinet and begins preparing a penicillin injection. His hands move with practiced efficiency, filling the syringe with thick white liquid. He explains through Zimmerman that Klaus will receive 1 injection now and oral antibiotic pills to take twice daily for 7 days. The infection will start to improve within 24 to 48 hours. Klaus watches these preparations with the expression of a man watching a magic trick. He knows there must be a trap somewhere. There is always a trap. Fletcher cleans Klaus's wound with antiseptic solution. The liquid burns, and Klaus bites his lip to keep from crying out. Fletcher applies a clean white bandage, stark and professional, against Klaus's dirty skin. Then he administers the penicillin injection into Klaus's upper arm. The needle goes in smoothly, and Klaus feels the burn of the medication spreading through muscle tissue. Fletcher hands Klaus a small paper envelope. Inside are 14 white tablets, penicillin pills. He explains that Klaus must take 1 pill in the morning and 1 in the evening until all the pills are gone. Even if the infection looks better, Klaus must finish all the medication. Stopping early will allow the bacteria to return stronger. Klaus takes the envelope and holds it like it's made of glass. His hands shake from fever and from something else: incomprehension. He asks a question in German that makes Zimmerman pause before translating. How much does this cost? Fletcher looks confused. Cost? Klaus's voice gains urgency as he speaks to Zimmerman. How much must I pay? How many extra work hours? What is the price? Fletcher's confusion deepens. There is no cost. Medical care and medication are provided by the camp under the Geneva Convention. Klaus stares at the envelope of pills, then at Fletcher, then back at the pills. His eyes fill with tears. He doesn't cry, but his voice shakes when he speaks. Zimmerman translates quietly. I did not know anyone would care if we lived or died. The room goes very still. Fletcher processes this statement, the weight of it, the history compressed into those words. He realizes suddenly how vast the gap is between policy and perception. The United States provides medical care to prisoners because the Geneva Convention requires it. But Klaus never expected to receive that care because every authority figure he has ever encountered has taught him that his life has no value. Fletcher tells Zimmerman to make sure Klaus understands he should return to the clinic in 3 days for a follow-up examination. If the infection is not improving, Klaus needs to come back immediately. Fletcher also tells Klaus that if he has any other health problems, he should report them. There is no punishment for being sick or injured. That is not how this camp operates. Klaus nods slowly. He is still holding the envelope of pills, staring at them every few seconds as if he expects them to disappear. He thanks Fletcher in broken English. "Thank you." One of the few English phrases he knows. Fletcher nods and tells him to go rest. Klaus leaves the clinic, walking slowly. He looks at the pills in his hand every few steps. Other prisoners working in the compound notice him emerging from the clinic. They watch him walk back toward the barracks. No one says anything, but questions hang in the air. But Klaus didn't know that this single injection would trigger a chain reaction that would change not just his life, but the lives of 3,000 men behind the wire. And he didn't know that his shock, his tears, his disbelief would force Corporal Thomas Fletcher to confront a truth he had never fully understood, that mercy means nothing if the person receiving it has been taught mercy doesn't exist. To understand why Klaus Weber was so shocked by receiving antibiotics, we need to go back 3 weeks, back to the moment the infection began. Back further to understand why Klaus made the decision not to report an injury that would nearly kill him. It is late June 1944. Klaus has been at Camp Breckenridge for 6 weeks. He works on a farm detail repairing fences under the Kentucky sun. The work is hard but manageable. The food is regular, more than Klaus has eaten in months. There are no beatings. The guards are distant but not cruel. Klaus has learned to keep his head down and do his work and not draw attention. On this particular morning, Klaus is repairing a section of barbed wire fence that separates the prisoner compound from the farmland beyond. The sun is already hot at 8 in the morning. His shirt sticks to his back with sweat. The smell of bacon drifts from the camp kitchen, and Klaus's stomach clenches with hunger, even though he ate breakfast 2 hours ago. That smell, real American bacon sizzling and popping in a cast iron skillet, is a luxury Klaus hasn't experienced since before the war. He is focused on the fence work, threading new wire through metal posts when the strand he is holding snaps suddenly. The wire whips back and slices across his left palm, 1 inch long, not particularly deep. Blood wells up immediately, bright red in the morning sun. Klaus stops working and examines the cut. It hurts, but pain is familiar. The cut probably needs stitches or at least proper cleaning and bandaging. Klaus knows he should report this to the guard supervising the work detail. The guard would take him to the clinic. That would be the logical, safe decision. Klaus looks at the guard, a heavy-set corporal standing in the shade 20 yards away. Then Klaus looks at the cut on his palm. Then he makes a choice that will nearly kill him. He doesn't report the injury. His reasoning is simple, built from 8 months of experience since his capture. If he reports the cut, one of several things will happen. He will be accused of carelessness and punished. Or he will be accused of deliberately injuring himself to avoid work and punished more severely. Or he will be taken off the farm detail and locked in the barracks for days while they investigate whether this was self-inflicted. Klaus has learned that reporting problems creates more problems. So he tears a strip of fabric from the hem of his undershirt, wraps it around his palm, and goes back to work. The bleeding stops after 20 minutes. The makeshift bandage holds. No one notices. That evening, Klaus receives his dinner ration. Cornbread, beans, a small piece of pork. It is the most substantial meal he has eaten since his capture 8 months earlier. He focuses on the food, on the unexpected generosity of real meat, and ignores the throbbing in his left hand. Tomorrow the cut will start to heal. Everything will be fine, except everything is not fine. Klaus doesn't clean the wound properly because he has no access to antiseptic. He changes the dirty cloth bandage every few days, but the fabric itself is contaminated. The rusty barbed wire that cut him carried bacteria deep into the tissue. Within 3 days, the wound is infected. At first, the infection seems minor. The cut is red and slightly swollen, but Klaus has had infected cuts before. They hurt, they ooze a little, then they heal. He continues working, continues changing, the bandage continues, telling himself this is normal. By day 10, it is clear nothing about this is normal. The cut is now surrounded by tissue that is hot to the touch, swollen to twice its normal size. The swelling has spread to Klaus's entire hand. Pus leaks from the wound soaking through the bandage overnight. Klaus develops a fever. He wakes in the night, drenched in sweat, shivering despite the summer heat. Other prisoners in Klaus's barracks begin to notice. His bunkmate, a man named Ernst Hoffmann, asks about the hand. Ernst is 45 years old, a former medic in the Wehrmacht before his capture in North Africa. He has seen infected wounds. He knows what lymphangitis looks like. Ernst examines Klaus's hand and forearm. The red streaks tracking up toward the elbow are unmistakable. This is blood poisoning. The bacteria from the wound are spreading through Klaus's lymphatic system. If the infection reaches Klaus's heart, he will die of sepsis within days. Ernst tells Klaus he needs to see a doctor immediately. Klaus says no. Ernst asks why. Klaus says because there is no point. They will not help him. Ernst says you don't know that. Klaus says I do know that. I have seen what happens when you ask for help. Ernst sits down on the bunk beside Klaus. He asks quietly what Klaus has seen, and Klaus tells him. Klaus Weber was born in Rosenheim, Bavaria in 1926. His father, Johann Weber, was a carpenter. His mother, Margareta, worked part-time as a seamstress. Klaus had one younger sister, Anna, 14 years old when Klaus was drafted. They were an ordinary family in an ordinary town, Catholic working class, trying to survive the economic chaos of post-depression Germany. Johann Weber was killed on the Eastern Front in 1942. Klaus was 16 when the telegram arrived. He watched his mother read it, watched her face go blank, watched her fold the telegram carefully and put it in a drawer, and never speak of it again. After that, Margaret worked full-time in a munitions factory. Anna stayed in school. Klaus helped when he could. On September 15, 1943, Klaus received his draft notice. He was 17 years old. He had no choice. Germany was bleeding soldiers faster than it could replace them, and the conscription age had dropped to 17, then 16 in some regions. Klaus reported to the training camp in Bavaria with 60 other boys from surrounding towns. The training camp was brutal. 6 weeks of forced marches, weapons drill, and psychological conditioning designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it as obedience. The camp medic was a sergeant in his 50s who treated medical complaints with contempt. Klaus developed severe blisters on both feet from the forced marches and ill-fitting boots. He went to sick call on day 12 of training. The medic looked at his feet, looked at Klaus and said, "You think the Russians will care about your blisters? You think they will give you soft boots and a rest day? Toughen up or die, that is your choice." Klaus limped back to his barracks. His feet bled through his socks for another week before the blisters finally hardened into calluses. The lesson was clear. Do not ask for help. No one will give it. In November 1943, Klaus was assigned to the 316th Infantry Division and deployed to Italy. The division was tasked with defending positions south of Rome against the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. Klaus spent 3 months in trenches and foxholes under constant artillery bombardment and air attack. The rations were inadequate. The winter was cold and wet. Men got sick, got injured, and mostly did not get treated. The unit had one medic for 200 men. His name was Corporal Dieter Engel, and he was 28 years old with a field medical kit that contained bandages, morphine, and sulfa powder. No antibiotics, no surgical equipment beyond a basic suture kit. When men were wounded, Engel did what he could, which was often nothing. Klaus watched a 19-year-old private named Dieter Kessler die over 5 days from an infected leg wound. Kessler had been hit by shrapnel, a piece of metal the size of a coin embedded in his calf. Engel removed the shrapnel, cleaned the wound with what antiseptic he had bandaged it, and told Kessler to keep it clean. But the wound was already contaminated. Within 2 days, it was infected. Within 4 days, the infection had spread up Kessler's leg, turning the tissue black. Kessler screamed for help. He begged Engel for medicine. Engel had nothing to give him. There were no antibiotics available to frontline units. Kessler died on day 5, delirious with fever, his legs swollen to twice its normal size. Klaus helped bury him in a shallow grave behind the trench line. That was not the last death Klaus witnessed from infected wounds. A corporal with shrapnel in his abdomen lay in the trench for 8 hours before dying. No morphine available. A lieutenant with a compound fracture of the femur went into shock from blood loss before an ambulance could reach the position. The roads were under constant artillery fire. Evacuation was impossible most days. Klaus learned the lesson his training camp medic had taught him. No one will help you. You survive on your own or you don't survive. Asking for help is pointless because help doesn't exist. In February 1944, Klaus's unit was surrounded by American forces during the Allied offensive at Anzio. After 3 days without food, ammunition, or water, the officers ordered to surrender. Klaus and 200 men marched out of their positions with their hands raised, expecting to be shot. The Americans did not shoot them. They processed the prisoners mechanically, searched them for weapons, zip-tied their wrists, and marched them to a temporary holding camp. The holding camp was a muddy field in northern Italy, surrounded by barbed wire. 500 German prisoners, no shelter, minimal food, 1 meal per day, thin soup and bread. It rained most nights. Men slept on the wet ground wrapped in whatever clothing they had. There was a single American medic assigned to the camp, a bored-looking private, who sat in a tent and treated only the most critical cases. Men bleeding from arterial wounds, men with compound fractures, men in shock. Everything else was ignored. Klaus watched a prisoner approach the medic with an infected arm wound. The prisoner explained through an interpreter that the wound was getting worse, that he needed medicine. The medic glanced at the wound and said, "Not life-threatening next." That prisoner's arm was later amputated at a field hospital. After the infection spread to the bone, Klaus spent 2 weeks in that holding camp before being transferred to a larger transit facility. The transit facility had tents and latrines and more regular meals, but medical care remained minimal. Klaus saw men suffer from untreated wounds, dysentery, pneumonia, dental abscesses. The lesson was reinforced over and over. Medical care is rationed. Prisoners are the lowest priority. Do not expect help. In April 1944, Klaus was loaded onto a cargo ship bound for the United States. The Atlantic crossing took 18 days. The ship was crowded, the conditions cramped, but not brutal. The ship's medical officer treated acute emergencies only. Klaus stayed healthy and kept his head down. The ship docked in New York Harbor. Klaus saw the Statue of Liberty through a porthole, a strange irony he did not have the energy to contemplate. The prisoners were processed through an intake facility in Virginia. The medical screening consisted of a temperature check and a visual inspection. No one asked if Klaus was injured or sick. From Virginia, Klaus was transported by train to Kentucky. He stared out the window at American farmland, at the abundance of crops and livestock, at a country that seemed untouched by war. When the train arrived at Camp Breckenridge, Klaus expected another transit camp. More mud, more wire, more indifference. Instead, he found a sprawling facility with wooden barracks, paved roads, a mess hall that smelled like real food, and a small clinic building with a red cross painted on the door. The camp held 3,000 German prisoners. They worked on farm details, repaired equipment, maintained the grounds. The food was regular and adequate. The guards were distant, but not violent. The barracks had bunks with mattresses and blankets. Klaus adapted quickly. The work was hard but manageable. No one beat him. No one starved him. But Klaus noticed something strange. Despite the presence of a clinic, almost no prisoners went to sick call. Men worked through injuries and illnesses, treating themselves with improvised remedies hiding symptoms. Private Henry Zimmerman, the interpreter, noticed this pattern and mentioned it to Corporal Fletcher. "Why won't they report health and problems?" Fletcher said he didn't understand. Zimmerman said they don't believe you'll actually help them. Fletcher said that's ridiculous. We have a fully equipped clinic. Zimmerman said having a clinic and being willing to use it on prisoners are two different things in their minds. Fletcher wanted to prove Zimmerman wrong. He wanted to believe that providing medical care would be enough. But he was beginning to understand that trust once broken is not easily rebuilt. You can offer help, but if the person you're offering it to has learned through bitter experience that help doesn't exist, your offer means nothing. 3 weeks after cutting his hand, Klaus Weber finally has no choice. The fever is so high he can barely stand. The infection has spread far enough up his arm that Ernst Hoffmann physically drags him to his feet and says, "You are going to sick call, and if you refuse, I will carry you." Klaus does not have the strength to resist. Ernst supports Klaus as they walk across the compound toward the clinic. It is early morning, July 18th. The sun is already warm. The smell of breakfast cooking drifts from the mess hall. Bacon and eggs, coffee, the smells of abundance. Other prisoners watch them walk past. This is a test case. If Klaus receives real treatment, maybe others will follow. If Klaus is dismissed or punished, the fear is confirmed. Klaus stands at the clinic door with his hand on the frame. His entire body is shaking from fever and from fear. Ernst says quietly, "Last chance to choose death." Klaus says, "I'm not choosing death. I just don't believe in help." Ernst says then, "Let's find out which of us is right." They enter the clinic. Fletcher looks up from his desk and immediately sees the state Klaus is in. Fever, bright eyes, sweat, soaked shirt, the hand wrapped in filthy cloth bandages. Fletcher stands and says, "Bring him to the examination table now." Which brings us full circle to the moment we began with. Klaus sitting on the table, Fletcher unwrapping the bandage. The smell of infection cutting through the summer air. The red streaks of lymphangitis climbing toward Klaus's heart. The penicillin pill held out like an offering. Klaus's trembling hand reaching for something he never believed existed. Klaus takes the pill. He swallows it with water from a tin cup. The pill goes down hard, catching in his dry throat. He coughs, drinks more water, and then just sits there, holding the empty cup, staring at nothing. Fletcher tells him through Zimmerman that he can return to his barracks. He should rest for the remainder of the day. Take the next penicillin pill this evening. Return in 3 days for follow-up. Klaus nods mechanically and stands. He walks out of the clinic into the bright Kentucky morning. Ernst is waiting outside. Klaus shows him the bandaged hand in the envelope of pills. Ernst examines the bandage, clean and white and professionally applied. He looks at Klaus and says, "So it is true. They actually gave you medicine." Klaus says, "I don't understand this place." Ernst says, "Neither do I. But maybe we have been wrong about what to expect." They walk back to the barracks together. By the time they arrive, the other prisoners already know something significant happened. Word spreads quickly in a camp of 3,000 men living in close quarters. The German prisoner with the infected hand went to the American clinic and came back with real medicine. Hans Richter, 34 years old, captured in North Africa 15 months earlier, asked to see the pills. Klaus opens the envelope and shows him. Hans examines one tablet and confirms it looks like genuine penicillin. Not aspirin, not placebo, the real thing. Hans asks, "They actually gave this to you?" Klaus says yes. Hans asks, "What did it cost?" Klaus says nothing. Medical care is free under the Geneva Convention. Hans shakes his head slowly. He says, "I have been in 3 different camps. I have never received real medical care beyond bandages and aspirin. If what you are saying is true, this camp is different." Friedrich Schultz, 22 years old, captured in Italy, says maybe it's propaganda. Maybe the Americans are being nice now to make prisoners think they are civilized, but it won't last. Eventually, the real treatment will start. Klaus listens to this debate. He is too fevered and exhausted to participate. But he says one thing that makes everyone go quiet. "I don't care if it's propaganda. My hand was rotting. They gave me medicine. That is more than our own army did for me." No one responds to that statement. It is seditious, but it is also undeniably true. The German military did not have antibiotics to give to frontline troops or prisoners. The American military has antibiotics and is giving them to enemy prisoners. The cognitive dissonance is profound. Klaus lies down on his bunk. Ernst tells the others to let him rest. Over the next 2 days, the entire barracks watches Klaus's recovery with scientific attention. Every prisoner in that room understands that Klaus is the test case for whether American promises of medical care are real or lies. By the second day, the change is visible. The redness in Klaus's hand begins to fade. The swelling decreases. The lymphangitis streaks on his forearm lighten in color. Klaus's fever breaks during the night. He wakes soaked in sweat but clear-headed for the first time in a week. On the morning of July 20th, Klaus eats breakfast and actually tastes the food. Bacon, eggs, coffee. The bacon is crispy, salty, rich with fat. The eggs are scrambled with real butter. The coffee is strong and hot. Klaus realizes he is hungry, truly hungry for the first time since the infection took hold. The other prisoners crowd around him at the breakfast table examining his hand. The swelling is noticeably decreased. The skin color is returning to normal. The bandage is clean changed daily by Klaus himself using the supplies Fletcher gave him. Ernst checks Klaus's pulse and temperature. Both are normal. Ernst says quietly to Klaus, "You are healing." Klaus says, "I know." Ernst says, "Do you understand what this means?" Klaus says it means the medicine works. Ernst says it means more than that. It means they told the truth. On July 21st, Klaus returns to the clinic for his follow-up appointment. He walks there alone, no longer needing Ernst's support. Fletcher examines the hand. The wound is healing properly. The infection is clearing. No fever, no lymphangitis, no signs of systemic involvement. Fletcher tells Klaus through Zimmerman that the infection is clearing up. Continue taking the pills for the full 7 days as prescribed. Klaus thanks Fletcher, and this time his voice is steady, confident. He no longer expects to be punished or dismissed. He no longer flinches when Fletcher touches his hand to examine it. Fletcher notices this change. The defensive hunch in Klaus's shoulders is gone. He makes eye contact now. He asks questions about the medication schedule. He is behaving like a patient who trusts his doctor. Fletcher says to Klaus through Zimmerman, "I need to ask you something. Why did you wait so long to come here?" Klaus considers how to answer. Then he says, "I thought you would punish me for being careless, or you would laugh and send me away." That is what always happened before. Fletcher asks always. Klaus describes his experiences. The training camp medic who refused to treat blisters. The unit medic in Italy with no supplies. The holding camp where infected wounds were ignored. The transit system where medical screening was perfunctory at best. 8 months of learning that authority figures do not help. Fletcher is quiet for a long moment. Then he says, "I'm sorry you experienced that. But that's not how this camp operates. And Klaus, I need you to help me spread that message. Other men are suffering because they're afraid to ask for help. Your barracks trust you. If you tell them it's safe to come to sick call, they'll believe you more than they'll believe me." Klaus is surprised. "You want my help?" Fletcher says, "You're proof the medicine works. You're proof we keep our promises." "Yes, I want your help." Klaus agrees. This decision made in a Kentucky clinic on a hot July morning will shape the trajectory of his entire life. He becomes an unofficial liaison between the prisoners and the medical staff. He translates not just language, but trust. He tells his story, shows his healed hand, encourages others to report health problems. Over the next 2 weeks, sick call attendance increases dramatically. Men who have been suffering with untreated conditions for months finally seek help. A 52-year-old prisoner named Otto Brandt comes in with chronic stomach pain he has endured for 8 months. He is diagnosed with an ulcer and given medication. A 24-year-old named Werner Koch comes in with an abscessed tooth that has been causing fever and facial swelling. The tooth is extracted by the camp dentist. A 29-year-old named Paul Steinberg comes in with a persistent cough and chest pain. He is diagnosed with early-stage pneumonia and treated with antibiotics. Each of these men goes through the same emotional journey Klaus did. Disbelief, confusion, gradual acceptance that the care is real, and then gratitude. But Klaus didn't know, as his hand healed and his role as medical liaison expanded, that his story was about to become far more complicated. He didn't know that a letter was making its way across the Atlantic, carried by Red Cross mail, containing news that would transform his understanding of what mercy means and what it costs. And he didn't know that in the camp administration building, a grieving sergeant named Robert Walsh was about to discover that enemy prisoners were receiving penicillin. Walsh, who had lost his 19-year-old son on the beaches of Normandy exactly 6 weeks earlier. Walsh, whose grief had hardened into rage. Walsh, who was about to demand answers about why German prisoners deserved medicine American boys had died without. The pill Klaus swallowed on July 18th saved his hand, but the chain reaction that pill triggered was only beginning. In the next 2 weeks, Klaus Weber's life would intersect with forces larger than one infected wound and one dose of antibiotics. He would learn that mercy is never simple, that healing one person can feel like betrayal to another, and that sometimes the hardest question is not whether to help an enemy, but whether helping an enemy makes you a traitor to your own. Klaus's hand healed completely. The scar was small, a thin white line across his palm that would fade over the years. But the memory of receiving that penicillin, of holding those pills in his hand and not believing they were real, that memory would never fade. It would shape every decision Klaus made for the next 58 years of his life. and it would ripple forward through thousands of lives Klaus would touch in ways neither he nor Corporal Thomas Fletcher could possibly imagine on that July morning in 1944, when a medic offered mercy and a prisoner learned to accept it. The news spreads through Camp Breckenridge like water finding cracks in stone. Klaus Weber received real medicine. The American medic actually treated him. The penicillin actually worked. Within 48 hours of Klaus's follow-up appointment, the story has reached every barracks, every work detail, every corner of the compound where 3,000 German prisoners try to make sense of their captivity. On July 23, 1944, a 38-year-old prisoner named Otto Brandt walks to the clinic. He has been suffering with stomach pain for 8 months. Sharp, burning pain that wakes him at night. Pain that makes every meal feel like swallowing broken glass. He has told no one because he assumed complaining about stomach pain would get him accused of malingering or worse. Otto enters the clinic expecting dismissal. Instead, Fletcher examines him thoroughly, asks detailed questions through Zimmerman, and diagnoses a duodenal ulcer. Fletcher prescribes medication and dietary modifications. He tells Otto to return weekly for monitoring. The entire appointment takes 30 minutes. Otto walks out holding a bottle of antacid medication and a written diet plan, and he is crying. The next day, Werner Koch appears at sick call, 24 years old, captured at Anzio, suffering from an abscessed tooth that has made the entire left side of his face swell. The pain has been unbearable for 2 weeks, but Werner assumed no one would care about a toothache. The camp dentist, Captain Morris, extracts the infected tooth under local anesthetic and prescribes antibiotics for the remaining infection. Werner leaves the clinic with gauze packed in his mouth and a bottle of pills, and for the first time in 2 weeks, his face is not screaming with pain. On July 26, Paul Steinberg comes to sick call. 29 years old, persistent cough for 3 weeks, chest pain when he breathes deeply. Fletcher listens to his lungs with a stethoscope and hears the distinctive crackle of fluid. Early stage pneumonia. Fletcher starts Paul on antibiotics immediately and orders him to light duty only for 2 weeks. Paul protests that he can work. Fletcher says, "No, you rest or the pneumonia will kill you." Paul rests. Each of these men experiences the same shock Klaus did. The disbelief that medical care is real and available and not conditional on anything except need. The confusion when authority figures help instead of punish. The gradual acceptance that maybe this camp operates under different rules than everything they have experienced before. Klaus watches this transformation with something close to wonder. He helps Zimmerman translate during sick calls. He encourages prisoners who are hesitant to seek treatment. He tells his story over and over. "Look at my hand. 3 weeks ago it was rotting. Now it is healed. They gave me medicine. They will give you medicine too. You only have to ask." By early August, sick call attendance has stabilized at what Fletcher considers healthy levels. 20 to 30 prisoners per day seeking treatment for various conditions. Work injuries, chronic illnesses, minor infections, dental problems. Fletcher and the other medical staff treat them all according to standard protocols. The camp medical supply inventory shows a dramatic increase in antibiotic usage, but the prisoner population is healthier than it has been since the camp opened. Fletcher writes in his daily log, "Prisoner trust in medical services has increased significantly following successful treatment of Klaus Weber's hand infection. Sick call attendance up 400% from June levels. Notable decrease in untreated chronic conditions. This suggests previous low utilization was due to fear rather than actual health of prisoner population." Fletcher believes the situation is resolved. Provide competent medical care, prove it is available without conditions, and prisoners will use it. Simple. Effective. The system is working exactly as the Geneva Convention intended. Fletcher does not yet know that Sergeant Robert Walsh has been reviewing medical supply inventories. He does not know that Walsh noticed the spike in antibiotic usage. He does not know that Walsh lost his son at Normandy 6 weeks ago, and that grief has sharpened into something harder than steel. On August 2, 1944, Walsh requests a meeting with the camp medical officer, Captain James Sullivan. Walsh brings documentation, supply requisition forms showing penicillin sulfa drugs and morphine distributed to the prisoner clinic, calculated costs, itemized lists of medications given to specific prisoners on specific dates. Walsh sits across the desk from Sullivan and says, "We are using our antibiotics on prisoners." Sullivan says, per Geneva Convention, Article 15, prisoners of war are entitled to adequate medical care. The United States is a signatory to the convention. We are legally required to provide treatment. Walsh says my son died screaming for a medic in France. Those pills could have saved American boys. Instead, we are giving them to the enemy. Sullivan's face softened slightly. He says, Sergeant, I understand your grief. I cannot imagine what you are going through. But the law is clear. We must provide medical care to prisoners. Walsh says, don't talk to me about my grief like it is something to be managed. Talk to me about why German prisoners are getting medicine American soldiers died without. Sullivan says carefully, our medical supply chain prioritizes combat troops first, then field hospitals, then stateside facilities including prisoner of war camps. The penicillin we use here does not come from the same supply pool that serves frontline units. We are not taking medicine away from our wounded. Walsh says that is a bureaucratic distinction without moral difference. We have antibiotics. American boys need antibiotics. We are giving antibiotics to Germans. Explain to me how that is not betrayal. Sullivan has no good answer to that question. It is a legitimate moral challenge. He falls back on the only answer he has. We follow the Geneva Convention because we expect other nations to follow it when they hold our prisoners. Reciprocity protects American soldiers captured by the enemy. Walsh says quietly, my son was not captured. He was killed on a beach before he ever had a chance to be protected by any convention. So do not tell me about reciprocity. Tell me about justice. Sullivan says, I am sorry about your son. Truly. But I cannot change policy based on one man's grief, no matter how justified that grief may be. Walsh stands. He says, then I am filing a formal complaint with Colonel Boyd. This policy needs review. He leaves the office without saluting. Sullivan sits at his desk for a long time after Walsh leaves. He understands Walsh's position. He might feel the same way if he had lost a son. But policy is policy and law is law, and the United States does not abandon its treaty obligations because following them is emotionally difficult. Sullivan does not report this conversation to Fletcher. He assumes the complaint will be reviewed and dismissed, and that will be the end of it. He is wrong. On August 4th, Klaus receives a letter from the Red Cross. Mail delivery happens once a week, and most prisoners receive nothing. Mail from Germany is sporadic at best, routed through neutral countries, delayed by months. Klaus has been at Camp Breckenridge for 3 months and has received no word from his family since his capture 6 months ago. When the mail clerk calls his name, Klaus feels his stomach drop. Letters can contain anything. Good news, bad news, worse news. He takes the envelope with hands that want to shake and walks back to his barracks. Ernst is sitting on his bunk cleaning his boots. He looks up when Klaus enters and immediately understands something significant has happened. Ernst says, letter from home. Klaus nods. He sits on his own bunk and stares at the envelope. German stamps Red Cross routing marks his mother's handwriting on the address. Klaus has not seen that handwriting in 6 months. Ernst says, do you want me to read it first? Klaus says, no, I will read it. But his hands shake as he opens the envelope. The letter is written on thin paper, the kind civilians use when paper is rationed. The handwriting is his mother's, but less steady than Klaus remembers. The letter is dated May 15, 1944. It has taken 11 weeks to reach him. Klaus reads silently. His face goes through several expressions. Relief, confusion, horror. Ernst says, what is it? Klaus does not answer immediately. He reads the letter again slower, making sure he understood correctly. Then he hands it to Ernst without speaking. Ernst reads aloud, quietly translating the formal German into simpler language as he goes. My dear Klaus, I pray this reaches you and finds you well. The Red Cross told me you are in a camp in America called Kentucky. I had to look at a map to understand how far away you are. Anna is safe. She works now in the same factory as me. The town was bombed in May. Our house lost the roof, but the walls stand. We are repairing it slowly. Ernst pauses. He glances at Klaus, then continues reading. I must tell you something difficult. I was injured in the bombing. My left leg was crushed by falling timber. The local doctor did what he could, but the wound became infected. He says I need antibiotics, something called penicillin, but there is none available in Rosenheim. The Army takes all medical supplies for the front. The doctor says the infection may require amputation if it cannot be stopped. I am trying to be strong, but I am frightened, Klaus. I think of you every day and pray you are treated well. Your loving mother, Margaret. Ernst lowers the letter. He looks at Klaus. Neither of them speaks for a long moment. Finally, Ernst says, when was this written? Klaus says, May 15th. Almost 3 months ago. Ernst says then by now either the infection has been treated or the leg has been amputated. Or worse. Klaus says nothing. He stares at the envelope of penicillin pills on his shelf. He finished the course of antibiotics 2 weeks ago, but he kept the empty envelope. A talisman. Proof that what happened was real. The irony is so crushing it feels physical. Klaus received free penicillin as a prisoner of war. His mother, a German civilian in Germany, cannot access penicillin because all medical supplies are diverted to the military. Klaus is healing. His mother is facing amputation or death. The same infection that nearly killed Klaus is destroying his mother's leg, and she is receiving no treatment because the country they both belong to has chosen to prioritize weapons over medicine. Ernst says carefully, there is nothing you can do from here. Klaus says, I know. Ernst says even if you could send the medicine, it would not arrive in time. Mail takes months, and sending medication across international lines during wartime is impossible. Klaus says, I know that too. Ernst says your mother would not want you to carry guilt over this. Klaus looks at Ernst and says, how do you know what my mother would want? Ernst is quiet. Klaus says more gently, I am sorry, I know you are trying to help, but there is no help available for this. Klaus lies down on his bunk and stares at the ceiling. He thinks about his mother, 48 years old, lying in a hospital, or maybe at home because hospitals are full. Her leg infected and swelling facing the amputation saw because medicine exists but is not available to her. He thinks about himself, 18 years old enemy prisoner, recipient of that same medicine given freely and without cost. The injustice of it is staggering. Not the simple injustice of war where one side has resources and the other does not, but the specific pointed injustice of a system that prioritizes keeping enemy prisoners healthy while allowing its own civilians to suffer. Klaus understands something in that moment that will shape his thinking for the rest of his life. Mercy is never distributed fairly. Someone always gets help while someone else is abandoned. The only question is who decides and what criteria they use. America decided to follow the Geneva Convention even when it felt like betrayal to men like Sergeant Walsh. Germany decided to pour every resource into the war machine even when it meant civilians like Margaret Weber lost their legs. Klaus gets up and walks to the edge of the compound. He stands at the fence line and looks out at Kentucky farmland stretching to the horizon. Cornfields green and abundant growing in soil untouched by bombs. This country is so rich it can afford to give penicillin to enemy prisoners. His country is so poor, it lets its own citizens die from treatable infections. Klaus makes a decision. If he survives this war, he will become a medic. He will do for others what Fletcher did for him. He will try to be the person his mother needed but could not have. It is the only response that makes sense. Turn grief into purpose. Turn helplessness into skill. Become someone who can help. That evening, Klaus goes to the clinic and asks to speak with Fletcher. Zimmerman is not on duty, but another interpreter, a private named Schmidt, is available. Klaus brings his mother's letter. Fletcher reads the letter through Schmidt's translation. His face shows pain. When he finishes, he looks at Klaus and says, I am so sorry. Klaus says, I want to ask you something. Even if it is impossible, I want to ask. Fletcher says, go ahead. Klaus says, I have 3 pills remaining from my treatment. I know 3 pills are not enough for a full course. I know mailing medicine internationally is illegal. I know it would be confiscated. But is there any way, any possible way, these pills could reach my mother? Fletcher is quiet for a long time. Then he says, no, there is no way. Even if we could mail them, which we cannot, 3 pills would not be sufficient to treat a serious infection. And the mail takes months. By the time anything reached Germany, your mother's situation will have already resolved one way or another. Klaus says then she will lose her leg. Or she already has. Fletcher says possibly. I cannot know. I wish I could help. Klaus says you did help. You saved my life. I'm not asking for more than that. I just needed to ask the question. Fletcher says, can I tell you something? Klaus nods. Fletcher says, before I became a medic, I was infantry. North Africa, 1943. My unit captured a German position near Kasserine Pass. There was a wounded German soldier, maybe 20 years old, shot in the abdomen. He was dying. It would take hours, painful hours. I had morphine in my kit. I could have helped him, made his death less agonizing. But my sergeant said, do not waste supplies on the enemy. I followed orders. That boy died in agony over 6 hours. I was standing guard 20 yards away. I could hear him screaming the entire time. Klaus listens without interrupting. Fletcher says I still hear those screams. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them. When I see you, when I see any of these prisoners, I see that soldier. I am trying to do better. I cannot save your mother. I cannot undo what I did in North Africa. But I saved you, and maybe that matters. Maybe doing better now counts for something, even if it does not fix the past. Klaus says quietly, it matters. What you did for me matters. I will spend the rest of my life trying to do the same for others. Fletcher says you will make a good medic. You have the most important qualification. Klaus says, what is that? Fletcher says, you remember what it feels like to need help and not receive it. That memory will make you compassionate. Klaus thanks Fletcher and returns to his barracks. He keeps his 3 remaining penicillin pills. He will carry them through the rest of the war through repatriation back to Germany. He will show them to his mother if she survives. He will keep them as a reminder of the day he learned that mercy is never simple and justice is never clean. But Klaus does not know yet that his story is about to collide with Sergeant Walsh's grief in ways that will force both men to confront questions neither wants to answer. On August 7th, Sergeant Robert Walsh corners Fletcher outside the clinic. It is late afternoon, the heat oppressive, the air thick with humidity. Fletcher is walking back to his quarters after a long day of sick calls. Walsh steps out from between 2 buildings and says, Corporal Fletcher, a word. Fletcher stops. He knows who Walsh is. Everyone knows who Walsh is. The sergeant who lost his son at Normandy. The man whose grief radiates from him like heat from a stove. Walsh says, you are the one handing out penicillin to prisoners. Fletcher says, I am treating infections per standard medical protocol. Walsh says, that boy you saved, Klaus Weber. He might have killed Americans in Italy. Fletcher says he is 18 years old. He was probably drafted. He did not choose to be in this war. Walsh says my son was 19. He volunteered, died on Omaha Beach. You think that German kid deserves medicine that could have saved? Daniel Fletcher says carefully, I am sorry about your son. Truly, deeply sorry. But my job is to treat sick people. That is what I swore to do when I became a medic. Walsh says even if those sick people are the enemy, Fletcher says the Hippocratic Oath does not have an exception clause for prisoners of war. Walsh takes a step closer. He is not threatening exactly, but his presence is heavy. He says then, maybe it should. Maybe deciding who deserves to live is part of war. Maybe saving an enemy is the same as killing your own. Fletcher says, I do not believe that. Walsh says, you do not have to believe it. But I filed a complaint with Colonel Boyd. Your little clinic and your generous distribution of American medicine to German prisoners is under review. We will see what the colonel thinks about your interpretation of medical ethics. Fletcher says the Geneva Convention requires us to provide medical care to prisoners. This is not my personal interpretation. It is international law. Walsh says international law did not save my son. So forgive me if I am not impressed by legal obligations to the enemy. He walks away. Fletcher stands in the heat for a long time watching Walsh's back disappear around a corner. Fletcher understands Walsh's position. He might feel the same way if he had lost a child, but understanding a position does not make it right. That night, Fletcher writes in his personal journal, a habit he has kept since basic training. Met Sergeant Walsh today. He lost his son at Normandy and believes I am betraying American soldiers by treating German prisoners. I understand his grief, but if we abandon our principles because following them is painful, what are we fighting for? The Geneva Convention exists precisely for moments like this, when mercy feels like betrayal. That is when mercy matters most. On August 9th, Colonel Harrison Boyd calls a meeting. Present are Boyd, Captain Sullivan Fletcher, and Walsh. They meet in Boyd's office, a sparse room with a desk, filing cabinets, and an American flag in the corner. Boyd reads Walsh's complaint aloud. The complaint is detailed, well-argued, and emotionally devastating. Walsh writes about Daniel's death, about the telegram, about the knowledge that his son died screaming for help that never came. He writes about the moral obscenity of providing enemy prisoners with medicine American soldiers lacked. He writes about the practical question of limited resources and the ethical question of priorities. Boyd finishes reading and sets the complaint on his desk. He says, "Sergeant Walsh, your complaint is noted and your sacrifice is honored." "Captain Sullivan, what is your medical assessment?" Sullivan says, "Sir, we are following Geneva Convention protocols. Prisoners receive adequate medical care as required by international law. The penicillin and other antibiotics we use here come from stateside supply chains, not from combat theater allocations. We are not diverting medicine away from our wounded troops." Walsh says that is a bureaucratic dodge. "We have medicine. American boys need medicine. We give medicine to Germans. The supply chain details do not change the moral reality." Boyd says, "Corporal Fletcher, what is your perspective?" Fletcher says, "Sir, in the past 4 weeks, sick call attendance among prisoners increased 400%. We have treated pneumonia-infected wounds, dental emergencies, chronic conditions that men suffered with for months because they were afraid to ask for help. They were afraid because their previous experiences taught them that authority figures do not help prisoners. When we helped Klaus Weber, we did not just save one hand, we saved the trust of 3,000 men. That trust means prisoners report health problems early instead of hiding them until they become life-threatening. That trust means lower mortality rates, less disease transmission, healthier work details, and a more stable camp environment. From a purely practical standpoint, treating prisoners well serves our interests." Walsh says, "You are talking about practicality. I am talking about justice. My son is dead. That German boy is alive. Explain to me how that is just." Fletcher says quietly, "It is not just. War is not just. Your son's death was not just. But two wrongs do not make a right. Letting Klaus Weber die would not bring your son back. It would just mean another mother loses another son." Walsh says his mother is German. Daniel's mother is American. They are not equivalent. Fletcher says grief is grief regardless of nationality. A mother bearing her son suffers the same in Berlin as she does in Virginia. Walsh's face goes hard. He says, "Do not philosophize at me about universal suffering. You did not lose a child." Fletcher says, "You are right, I did not, and I cannot imagine your pain. But Sergeant, with respect, your son died fighting for a country that believes in laws and treaties, and the idea that even in war there are rules. If we abandon those rules because following them hurts, we become the thing your son died fighting against." The room goes very quiet. Boyd looks at each man in turn. Sullivan's face is carefully neutral. Walsh's face shows rage and grief in equal measure. Fletcher's face shows exhaustion. Boyd says, "I have made my decision. Medical care for prisoners will continue as currently administered per Geneva Convention requirements. However, Corporal Fletcher, you will maintain detailed documentation of every treatment. You will justify every dose of antibiotics in writing. Supply usage will be reviewed monthly." "Understood." Fletcher says, "Yes, sir." Boyd says, "Sergeant Walsh, your complaint is officially noted in the record. Your concerns are valid and your sacrifice is recognized. But policy will not change. Do you understand?" Walsh says, "I understand that my son's life mattered less than international law." Boyd says, "That is not what I said." Walsh says, "It is what I heard." He salutes stiffly and leaves the office. Boyd watches him go. Then he says to Sullivan and Fletcher, "Dismissed. Keep doing your jobs." And Fletcher, "Document everything." Walsh is not wrong to ask these questions. Make sure we have good answers. Fletcher and Sullivan leave together. Outside the administration building, Sullivan says that was well handled. Fletcher says it did not feel well handled. "It felt like I was arguing with a grieving father about whether his son's death mattered." Sullivan says his son's death does matter, and so does Klaus Weber's life. "You are doing the right thing. Do not let Walsh's grief make you doubt that." Fletcher says, "I am not doubting, but I understand why he does." Over the next 2 weeks, the tension in camp shifts. Walsh does not speak to Fletcher again, but he watches. He observes Klaus helping prisoners navigate the clinic system. He sees the increase in sick call attendance. He notices that work details are more productive now that prisoners are healthier. He watches Werner Koch return to work after his tooth extraction, no longer feverish and in pain. He sees Paul Steinberg recover from pneumonia that could have killed him. Walsh's grief does not disappear. Grief like his does not disappear. But it becomes complicated by witnessing the practical effects of mercy. Watching Klaus translate during sick calls, seeing an 18-year-old German prisoner help other prisoners get medical care. Walsh cannot quite maintain the simple equation he wants. Enemy equals evil. Helping enemy equals betrayal. The reality is messier than that. On August 23rd, Walsh sees Klaus helping an elderly prisoner walk to the clinic. The prisoner is maybe 60 years old, captured in Italy, suffering from arthritis that makes walking difficult. Klaus supports the man's weight, matching his slow pace, speaking quietly to him in German. Walsh watches this for a long moment. He thinks about Daniel, who was 19 when he died. He thinks about what Daniel wanted to be after the war, a teacher. Daniel wanted to teach history to high school students because he believed understanding the past helped people build a better future. Daniel believed in education and mercy, in the idea that people could be better than their worst moments. Walsh thinks Daniel would have hated the man Walsh has become since the telegram arrived. This angry, bitter man looking for someone to blame. Daniel would have wanted Walsh to honor his memory by living according to the values Daniel fought for, not by abandoning those values out of grief. Walsh does not suddenly stop grieving. He does not suddenly forgive the German military for killing his son. But watching Klaus help an old man walk to the clinic, Walsh understands something he has been resisting. The boy helping that prisoner is not the same as the machine gunner who killed Daniel. Conflating all Germans into a single enemy makes grief simpler, but it also makes grief useless. Walsh walks away without approaching Klaus. But something has shifted. On September 1st, 1944, Klaus receives a second Red Cross letter. This one is dated July 20th, 2 months after the first letter. Klaus opens it with hands that do not shake quite as badly as last time. The letter is short. His mother is alive. The leg was amputated below the knee. She survived the surgery. She is learning to walk with a crutch. Anna is well engaged to a local farmer who returned from the Eastern Front missing 2 fingers, but otherwise healthy. The house is mostly repaired. The town is occupied by American forces. The treatment has been correct, no violence, regular rations. Klaus reads the letter twice. Then he walks to the clinic and asks if Fletcher is available. Fletcher sees him immediately. Klaus says through Schmidt, "My mother is alive. They amputated her leg. She survived." Fletcher says, "I am glad she survived. I am sorry about the leg." Klaus says, "I wanted you to know. You asked what happened. Now I know." Fletcher says, "How do you feel?" Klaus considers the question. He says, "I feel grateful she is alive. I feel angry she lost her leg because medicine was not available. I feel guilty that I received medicine she could not get. I feel determined to become a medic so I can help others avoid what she went through. I feel many things. None of them are simple." Fletcher says, "I understand that. Medicine is never simple. Helping one person while being unable to help another is the hardest part of this job." Klaus says, "But you keep doing it." Fletcher says, "Yes, because helping one person is still better than helping no one." Klaus says, "I will remember that." The summer turns to fall. September becomes October. The war continues in Europe and the Pacific, but Camp Breckenridge remains stable. Sick call attendance stays high. Prisoner health remains good. Fletcher's documentation of every treatment is meticulous. Walsh stops filing complaints. On October 15th, Walsh approaches Klaus for the first time. Klaus is working on a farm detail, harvesting late-season vegetables. Walsh walks up and says, "Private Weber." Klaus stops working and stands at attention. He has learned enough English to understand basic commands. He does not know what Walsh wants, but he knows Walsh's reputation. Walsh says, "Do you speak English?" Klaus says, "Small English, very small." Walsh gestures for Klaus to follow him. They walk to the edge of the field where no one else can hear. Walsh says slowly, using simple words, "I need to say something to you." Klaus waits. Walsh says, "I hated you. When you first came to the clinic, when Fletcher gave you penicillin, I wanted you to die. My son died, you lived. I wanted that to be different." Klaus says, "I understand." Walsh says, "But I watched you. For 3 months, I watched you. You help other prisoners. You translate. You make them trust the clinic. You probably saved 50 lives by doing that." Klaus says, "I only do what Corporal Fletcher asked." Walsh says, "No. You did more than that. You chose to help people even when you were suffering. Your mother lost her leg. I read the Red Cross letters. They crossed my desk. You could have been angry. You chose to be useful instead." Klaus does not know how to respond to this. Walsh says, "My son Daniel was 19 when he died. He wanted to be a teacher. He was kind. He would have hated what I became after he died. This angry man. I think Daniel would have liked you. I think he would have wanted me to say this. Walsh pauses. Then he says I was wrong. You are not the enemy. You are a boy caught in a war, just like my son. I am sorry I hated you for surviving when he did not. Klaus says in careful English, I am sorry your son died. I am sorry my country made war. I did not choose this. Walsh says I know. Neither did Daniel. Walsh extends his hand. Klaus stares at it for a moment, then shakes it. The handshake is brief, firm, and freighted with more meaning than either man can express. Walsh says when you become a medic, and I heard you want to remember this, healing an enemy is the hardest kind of mercy, but it is also the most important. Klaus says I will remember. Walsh walks away. Klaus returns to the vegetable harvest. His hands are shaking slightly, but not from fear. From the weight of understanding that mercy is more complicated than he ever imagined. That grief can transform into something other than rage. That enemies can become something other than enemies even if they never become friends. That evening, Klaus tells Ernst about the conversation. Ernst listens and says, you know what this means? Klaus says what Ernst says. It means Fletcher's mercy did not just save your hand. It saved Walsh's soul. Mercy ripples outward. You do not always see where it goes, but it goes somewhere. Klaus thinks about that. He thinks about the penicillin pills that healed his infection. He thinks about his mother's amputated leg. He thinks about Daniel Walsh dying on a beach in France. He thinks about Fletcher's decision to treat an enemy prisoner according to protocol instead of emotion. He thinks about Walsh's decision to confront his own grief instead of letting it consume him. Mercy ripples outward. Klaus will remember that for the rest of his life. On November 8, 1944, Franklin Roosevelt wins re-election to a fourth term as President of the United States. The news reaches Camp Breckinridge by radio. The prisoners do not care much about American politics, but they understand what the election means. The war will continue. Roosevelt is committed to unconditional surrender. There will be no negotiated peace. Germany will fight until it is destroyed or until it destroys itself. Klaus wonders if he will survive long enough to go home. He wonders what home will look like when the war ends. He wonders if his mother is walking yet with her crutch. He wonders if Anna will marry the farmer with the missing fingers. He wonders about 1,000 things he cannot control. What Klaus does not wonder about is whether he will become a medic. That decision is made. It is the only decision that makes sense in a world where mercy is distributed unfairly and grief is universal, and the only choice anyone has is whether to help or to harm. Klaus chooses to help. It is the only legacy that matters. The only response to suffering that creates something other than more suffering. The fall days grow shorter.